On February 12th of 1996, the New York Times reported that Republican Congressman Ralph Regula, a 12-term veteran from Ohio, ran into some rather intense grumbling among the faithful at a Republican gathering in his district. The complaint of these loyal Republicans: they felt that the Republican victory in the 1994 congressional elections had been squandered and that the huge gains in the House and Senate had been frittered away with little or nothing to show for it. These good people from Ohio are correct. And their sentiment is shared by millions of conservative and traditional-minded Americans from coast to coast. Why did this happen? Why hasn't the federal monster been tamed? Why hasn't the plunge toward the New World Order been stopped? The answer to these questions, in large part, is the influence of the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. I propose here a short history of Gingrich, which I feel will help to explain why there has been no rollback of the federal government under his leadership. I begin by contrasting the Gingrich performance of 15 years ago with that of another congressman from Georgia, Dr. Larry McDonald. It was in 1974 that the late Larry McDonald won his seat in Congress as a Democrat. To him, being a Democrat or a Republican mattered little, because he believed the basic standard for any American should be the Constitution of the United States. He never intended to take his direction from a speaker or a party leader if it conflicted. His commitment was to the Constitution. Once in office, McDonald quickly demonstrated that he would keep the promise he had made to the voters, that he would be guided solely by the document to which he'd sworn a solemn oath. He also became a significant force, leading other congressmen from both political parties to do likewise. It was, therefore, a real tragedy for our nation when he disappeared, along with hundreds of others, on KAL Flight 007 in September of 1983. In 1978, 4 years after McDonald won his seat in the House, the people of Georgia elected Newt Gingrich, a Republican, as the congressman from a nearby district. Reputed to be a strict conservative, he was the first Republican from Georgia to serve in the Congress in the 20th century. But right away, where McDonald, the Democrat, continued to score 100% on every conservative index, Gingrich was achieving only 80% or less. Let's take a look at the Gingrich performance right from his earliest days in Congress. The September 19, 1979 Constitution-based Conservative Index, published then by the Review of the News and since 1985 by its successor, the New American, shows McDonald with a 100% score and Gingrich with only 80%. Gingrich earned deficient marks in this rating period for voting for the creation of a Department of Education and for designating 68 million acres of mineral-rich land in Alaska as a federally protected wilderness. McDonald correctly maintained that there is no authorization in the U.S. Constitution for federal involvement in education. He also knew that a former leader of the American Communist Party named William Z. Foster called for a federal Department of Education by name in his 1932 book, Toward Soviet America. On page 316 of this book, and here is the book, it says, the communist Foster wrote, "Among the elementary measures the American Soviet government will adopt to further the Cultural Revolution are a National Department of Education. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois ideology. The students will be taught on the basis of Marxian dialectical materialism, internationalism, and the general ethics of the new socialist society." That's what William Z. Foster wrote in 1932. The measure creating the Federal Department of Education passed in the House by 210 to 206. A shift of 3 votes, therefore, would have defeated it. Ever since its creation, educational standards in America have plummeted. But Gingrich voted for something that the Constitution doesn't permit and the communists wanted. And he wasn't alone, because the Department of Education was also eagerly sought by then-President Jimmy Carter. The educational goals explicitly sought by America's communists are being achieved. These include removing from the schools religious and patriotic themes and promoting what William Z. Foster called internationalism, and the general ethics of a new socialist society. Regarding the Gingrich vote for locking up huge portions of the state of Alaska, we see again that the Constitution contains no authorization for federal land control. But there is an explicit call for land control in the very first of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Most Americans have never seen it, but here it is. The famous document crafted by Marx and Engels in 1848 calls for abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. The way our nation is being run, all land will soon be owned or controlled by the federal government, just as Marx and Engels wanted. Anyone who has ever read through the Communist Manifesto can see that our nation is following it almost completely. Marx wanted land control, a progressive income tax, termination of the rights of inheritance, a central bank, which is precisely what the Federal Reserve is, and government control of education. There are even explicit attacks in the manifesto on private property, the family, marriage, and homeschooling. The federal land grab should have been stopped years ago, but it wasn't, and it continues to the point where huge percentages of the territory of each of the 13 western states is now federally owned. The map that we're showing here depicts what is happening. The colored areas are federally controlled. The different colors simply indicate which of the many federal agencies controls which tracts. And I repeat, while there is no authorization for this federal land grab in the Constitution of the United States, there is a call for exactly what has been happening in the Communist Manifesto. The April 9th, 1980 Conservative Index again shows McDonald with a perfect 100% score and Gingrich with 2 deficiencies. Gingrich received bad marks this time for voting in favor of a holiday for Martin Luther King and for supporting the grant of Most Favored Nation status to Communist China. Most Favored Nation status for Communist China has enabled the tyrants who run that nation to flood America with slave labor goods, steal American jobs, and build up the treasury of the most murderous regime the world has ever seen. The people of Georgia thought that they had elected a stalwart anti-communist and conservative in Gingrich, but this was another early indication that they had not. There would be plenty more. It is also important to realize that dozens of congressmen had the same 100% score as McDonald during these rating periods. Gingrich would later vote to supply funds to promote trade with the Soviets, to transfer 2.2 million acres in Idaho to federal wilderness status, to arrange for federally funded loan guarantees to facilitate greater trade with Red China, to make taxpayer funds available to foreign governments through the Export-Import Bank, to grant amnesty to illegal immigrants, and to continue the costly monstrosity known as foreign aid. Gingrich did cast some votes that any constitutionalist could support, but the specific votes I have mentioned are those which clearly separated the Constitution's men from the establishment's boys. There were many more votes of this variety, but I think you begin to get my point. From his earliest days in Congress, Gingrich was never the hardcore conservative enemy of the establishment's drive for big government, even world government. I recall asking Larry McDonald about Gingrich 15 years ago. The prompt response I received was his assessment that Gingrich couldn't be trusted, was extremely ambitious, and would compromise principles whenever doing so would advance his own career. McDonald considered him a candidate for membership in the establishment that is leading our nation away from its foundations and into central control. As we shall see, Gingrich was formally welcomed into membership in the New York-based seat of the establishment's power, the Council on Foreign Relations, in 1990. Newt Gingrich is now touted as the leader of the conservative movement, supposedly the much-needed alternative to Bill Clinton and the forces of big government. Time magazine named him Man of the Year and called him exceptional, brilliant, amazing. The magazine even characterized him as the key individual who will arrange to have, quote, power flowing out of Washington devolving to the states, unquote. That, of course, hasn't happened because it was never intended to happen. But who is the real Newt Gingrich? William F. Jasper included a telling glimpse of the early Gingrich career in an article from the New American Magazine in December of 1994. Jasper reported what the current biography yearbook for 1989 revealed about the speaker. This publication's short bio sketch began by noting that after Gingrich graduated from Emory University in 1965, he received advanced degrees from Tulane University in 1968 and in 1971. He then became a professor at a state college in Georgia. But then the current biography yearbook for 1989 stated the following. His behavior at Tulane appeared to belie his future conservatism and hawkish foreign policy views. He accepted student deferments rather than face the draft during the Vietnam War, experimented with marijuana, led a campus demonstration defending the school paper's right to print a nude photograph of a faculty member, and campaigned for Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller of New York in 1968. Well, to put it mildly, these are not the credentials one would expect to find in a principled conservative. No campaigner for Nelson Rockefeller could ever seriously be characterized as a conservative. Yes, a man can change his course, and we wish Newt Gingrich had taken a different road from the one he began to travel as a young man. But we see no evidence that he did, even if the national media have chosen to portray him as something other than what he truly is. When the Republicans won control of the Congress in the elections of 1994, Gingrich had already risen to the position of deputy party leader in the House. He therefore had the inside track to become Speaker. Because he was about to become the most powerful man in the entire Congress, a great deal of attention came his way. Ever the brash professor, he produced a list of 8 books he wanted fellow members of Congress to read. One was the Declaration of Independence. Another was the Federalist Papers, written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, but the Constitution was not on his list. Another of the books that Gingrich recommended made many sit up and take notice. It was this one, The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler, originally published in 1980 and reissued in 1994 by the New Age Promoting Progress and Freedom Foundation in Washington. It behooves everyone to take a look at what this very close friend of Newt Gingrich is saying, because he enthusiastically endorses Alvin Toffler's proposals. Toffler believes that mankind is entering a completely new phase of development, the third wave, if you will. He claims that the first wave was based around agriculture, the second around industry, and now the third is being built around the great burst of information available to everyone. He therefore has recommendations about the way the world should be conducted in this new third wave of history. For America, Toffler has urged a whole new system of government because the old system can't work anymore. He begins the final chapter of the third wave with a letter he addressed to the founding parents, which is what he calls the founding fathers. Here in part is the revolutionary attitude Toffler has addressed to Washington, Franklin, Adams, Madison, and the other founding fathers. For the system of government you have fashioned, including the very principles on which you based it, is increasingly obsolete and hence increasingly, if inadvertently, oppressive and dangerous to our welfare. It must be radically changed and a new system of government invented, a democracy for the 21st century. And for this wisdom above all, I thank Mr. Jefferson, said Toffler, who helped create the system that served us so well for so long and that now must, in its turn, die and be replaced. Enough of Toffler. The principles of Americanism, obsolete and dangerous. The American system itself, also obsolete and dangerous. What the founders gave us must die and be replaced. I happen to believe that the U.S. Constitution and the principles upon which it is built are remarkable. Let's realize here that Toffler hasn't just attacked the Constitution. He's taken dead aim at the principles upon which it is based. What makes this so offensive is that the American system he calls oppressive and dangerous is based more than anything on a correct reading of human nature. Its whole thrust can be summed up in the need to limit government to its proper role of protecting rights. And it does so in carefully written terms because those men knew that if government isn't limited, some aspiring tyrant will get control and establish a tyranny. If this is so, then the Constitution need not be changed because human nature hasn't changed. The principles undergirding the Constitution were sound when there were 4 million Americans in an agriculture-based society more than 200 years ago, and they are no less sound today when there are 260 million Americans in a highly industrialized society. And let's add that they will still apply when there are even more Americans in any information-based society or any other kind of society envisioned by the Tofflers or anyone else. How many Americans there are and how they earn a living aren't the most fundamental considerations. We are still human beings possessed of a nature that doesn't change. And that realization 200 years ago led to the Constitution, and that Constitution ushered in the greatest nation in the history of the world. So I consider this book by Toffler a significant attack aimed at the very foundations of this nation. And the man who is the Speaker of the House endorses it, urges Americans to read it, and lends his name to everything it contains. And we are repeatedly told, he is the great leader who is going to bring America back to its roots. Gingrich even wrote a foreword to Alvin and Heidi Toffler's book entitled Creating a New Civilization. His relationship with the Tofflers goes back over many years, and he knows their thinking very well. Only a few days after the Republican triumph in 1994, Gingrich told a press conference, quote, "The best description of me is that I'm a conservative futurist. Marianne and I have for a long time been friends of Alvin and Heidi Toffler, the authors of Future Shock and the Third Wave." Now this man who is the Speaker of the House has repeatedly sworn an oath to adhere to the strict limitations in the U.S. Constitution. He has sworn this oath every second year at the beginning of each new Congress in which he has served. Yet, he rather brazenly endorses an attitude which holds that the document he's pledged to abide by is obsolete and must die and be replaced. In 1995, Gingrich authored his own book, about which he received plenty of attention because of the questionable financial arrangements surrounding its publication. Let's skip over that aspect of the book and look at its contents. The book is entitled To Renew America. Now, as I understand it, the word renew means to reinvigorate and not discard what was once new. My dictionary even supplies the word restore as a synonym. If America is to be restored politically and in numerous other ways, it stands to reason that its foundations would be given a new emphasis. It stands to reason that getting back to the Constitution would be the basis of the renewal. But Gingrich's book mentions the Constitution only once, merely to acknowledge that it exists. There is no discussion of its fundamental importance. Clearly, he doesn't intend to renew America. He intends to change it. Why skip over the Constitution? The answer to that is very simple. If the Constitution were the focus of Gingrich's attention, much of his program for America would be shown to be unconstitutional outside the document's strict limitations. Let's go back to the mid-1970s. In 1974, Larry McDonald won his seat in the Congress. This was the year that Newt Gingrich started running for Congress. It took him 3 tries before he finally made it. But 1974 was also the year when the incredibly subversive article, The Hard Road to World Order, was published in Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. This article was written by CFR heavyweight Richard N. Gardner. It lamented that a single leap into world government wasn't possible, so he brazenly called for, quote, an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. End quote. He even stated that the end run approach could produce some remarkable concessions of sovereignty that could not be achieved on an across-the-board basis. Clearly, this man wants the U.S. to commit suicide. Among the numerous recommendations to accomplish this end run, Gardner, as far back as 1974, remember. He called for disarmament programs, a UN military force, additional authority for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and new and broader enforcement powers to go along with membership in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. Later, Gardner repeated his thinly veiled call for the U.S. to give up its sovereignty in the spring 1988 issue of Foreign Affairs in another article entitled Practical Internationalism. In this one, he issued another call for further entanglement of the United States in the GATT arrangement. Now, no one from the Council on Foreign Relations has ever repudiated these explicit Gardner-authored attacks on national sovereignty. Instead, the CFR's journal has published other, less subtle assaults. But the overall goal remains the same. The Council on Foreign Relations wants to push the United States into a world government. And as many Americans have begun to discover, the CFR crowd has been getting its way for many, many years. More than 15 years ago, Larry McDonald said that Newt Gingrich could not be trusted, was extremely ambitious, and could be counted on to promote world government agenda of the establishment. In other words, Gingrich was a perfect candidate for membership in any powerful organization that would help to promote Newt Gingrich. So it came as little surprise to see the name Newton L. Gingrich listed as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in the beginning of 1990. As can be seen in our small little book, The Insiders, his name appears on the membership list of this organization's 3,200 members. So Gingrich has become a veteran member of the CFR by now. And this organization was founded in 1921 for the purpose of creating a world government and abolishing national independence. This organization's prestigious journal boldly published the call for an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. This same publication has published numerous similar calls for the demise of our constitutional republic. All right, jump ahead now to the fall of 1994, 20 years after the Gardner article in Foreign Affairs magazine. CFR member Gingrich's Republican Party has just won a huge victory in the 1994 congressional races. He's in line to be Speaker of the House. What does he do? He acquiesces in the convening of a lame duck session of Congress. Then he uses his considerable muscle to have Congress pass an important measure leading to the demise of this nation's sovereignty, much deeper involvement for the United States in GATT. He's already helped to get NAFTA passed. In both of these efforts, he stood shoulder to shoulder with Bill Clinton, another member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Numerous congressmen and newly elected representatives said that anything as important to the United States as submitting to GATT's World Trade Organization shouldn't be decided by defeated congressmen in a lame duck session. They wanted any vote on the matter to be postponed until the new Congress convened in January of 1995. They said that the issue should be decided by the newly elected members of Congress who reflected the current attitude of the American people, which attitude had just resoundingly been registered in the congressional elections. But no, Gingrich wanted the U.S. tied down by GATT's new powers, even though he himself had publicly stated only months earlier that doing so amounted to, quote, transferring from the United States significant authority to a new organization, close quote. Let's repeat that last quote. Early in 1994, Newt Gingrich testified before the House Ways and Means Committee. Listen to what he said about the plan to expand GATT's powers. Quote, "We need to be honest about the fact that we are transferring from the United States significant authority to a new organization. This is a transformational moment. This is not just another trade agreement. This is a very big transfer of power." End quote. This assessment of what was planned for GATT is absolutely correct. It's why the Council on Foreign Relations wanted the United States to submit to the trade bloc's regulatory powers. GATT has established a gigantic bureaucracy called the World Trade Organization, which is now the sole interpreter of 20,000 pages of trade regulations for 120 nations. This WTO essentially has life and death authority over America's economic interests. But the Constitution grants power to Congress and to Congress alone to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And Congress has no authority to delegate its powers to any other body. But with Newt Gingrich leading the way, GATT and its World Trade Organization have been given this power. Obviously, the Constitution doesn't mean very much to Gingrich. He showed that when he endorsed the attitude presented by the Tofflers, that the Constitution is outmoded and should be replaced. He has repeatedly confirmed that he has his own agenda and does not intend to be bound by the oath he took when he entered federal service. With Gingrich declining to object to the convening of that lame duck House session, Congress passed the GATT measure and tied this nation to the World Trade Organization on November 29, 1994. Only a few weeks before scores of its members would be leaving Congress because of defeat or retirement. As you may have noticed, only several months ago, the GATT World Trade Organization ruled against the United States and in favor of Brazil and Venezuela in a matter dealing with U.S. environmental standards for imported oil. We now have a 120-nation group deciding our laws, courtesy of Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich, Bob Dole, and all the other members of the House and Senate who voted for the GATT-related new powers over America. We have also learned that GATT will meddle in such matters as reducing the amount of money U.S. citizens can put aside for pensions. A headline from the December 5th, 1994 Wall Street Journal, the establishment newspaper that openly urged Congress to approve the GATT Accord. The headline reads, "GATT law to reduce amount Americans can save for pensions." Thank you, Newt Gingrich and friends. For the first half of 1995, the sole concern of the House of Representatives was the Gingrich-created contract with America. It's essential to realize, of course, that no congressman ever swore a solemn oath to the contract. Each did, however, swear an oath to the Constitution. To term the big push for the contract a misplaced emphasis is to understate the situation. It is lately being stated by conservatives that the Gingrich-led effort to enact the contract's many provisions was a good try. But as far as passage into law, practically none of it succeeded. As one critic stated, the contract with America is 3,000 miles wide and 3 inches deep. We should actually be pleased that so little of it became law. Almost every one of its 10 major provisions sought to repair or make more tolerable unconstitutional federal intrusions that should be abolished, not fixed up and made more acceptable. According to the Constitution, the federal government has no authorization to be involved in such contract measures as crime and welfare. But the contract aimed to legitimize or create new federal powers in these areas. The contract called for amending the Constitution to require a balanced budget. Every sound-thinking American wants a balanced budget, but an amendment to the Constitution says that the Constitution is deficient when it is not. Congress and the President are deficient, and this is where change is needed. The contract called for another amendment to enforce term limitations, again pointing to a supposed deficiency in the Constitution when the real deficiency is in the voting public that keeps sending substandard, even subversive individuals to Washington. While much of the contract dealt with domestic matters, one section dealt with foreign and military policy. It stated that American troops should not be placed under UN command, but it also stated that doing so would be acceptable if the President certified that such a deployment were in the vital security interests of the United States. That's not what America's taxpayers want from our military, and it's not what the Constitution permits. The purpose of this nation's military is simply to protect the life, liberty, and property of each American. It is not to police the world for the United Nations, NATO, or anything else. Allowing the President to send troops to the United Nations to protect the undefined vital security interests of the United States opens the door to sending them to Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, anywhere. The contract also called for the expansion of NATO to the nations of Eastern Europe, even to Russia. Nowhere does the contract explain that NATO is a subsidiary of the United Nations, a fact that is obvious to anyone who reads the 1949 NATO Treaty, which is full of mention of NATO's relationship to the United Nations. But there was an even more fundamentally harmful aspect of this contract with America. There are 74 freshman members of the U.S. House, most of whom were sent to Washington by the voters to reduce the size and power and cost of the federal government. And that's what they, along with quite a few veteran members of Congress, wanted most to do. But most of the freshmen and even many of the veterans fail to realize that they are repeatedly being led away from the Constitution and not urged to use it as the test for everything they should and should not do. Those responsible for diminishing the importance of the Constitution have achieved a significant victory for the forces that seek to destroy national independence and personal freedom. Our nation is ill-served by such a development. Now, we can blame these congressmen for allowing themselves to be taken off track. We can blame them for considering the Constitution less important. We can blame the education they receive for failing to impress upon them the fundamental worth of the Constitution in the first place. And then we can blame ourselves for choosing the kinds of leaders we have. But the man who bears a huge portion of the blame for leading the members of Congress away from the Constitution is Newt Gingrich. What are we to think when Newt Gingrich, the supposed alternative to a revolutionary Bill Clinton, joins the president in New Hampshire in June of 1995 for a love feast debate where not one of Mr. Clinton's many deficiencies were aired? Instead of using the nationally televised opportunity to point out the harmful policies being offered by the president and the reforms America really needs, Gingrich told the audience in Claremont, New Hampshire, that he was a big fan of Franklin Roosevelt and a big fan of Woodrow Wilson. This is an alternative to Bill Clinton? In March 1995, Gingrich gave a speech at the Nixon Center for Peace and Security. After praising himself for his role in the NAFTA and GATT measures, getting them through Congress, he told his audience that the United States must lead all over the world. His remarks caused a British newspaper, The Economist, to feature him in an article entitled "The Internationalists." But he's not supposed to be an internationalist. He's supposed to be a defender of the independence of the United States. Lately in our nation, anyone who refuses to champion globalism and interdependence faces being referred to as an isolationist. Hardly a day goes by without some attack in the media complaining about isolationism. And this is exactly the topic that the British newspaper article addressed in its revealing portrait of Gingrich. Here's what it said. If Mr. Clinton and Gingrich, as good internationalists, want to keep this isolation in check, they have work to do in their own parties. Strange as it may seem in these days of loud contrast politics, on this issue they are actually on the same side. So said the British newspaper. Yes, Clinton and Gingrich are on the same side, the internationalist side. As we have previously shown, this is also the side favored years ago by William Z. Foster, who was the top leader of the Communist Party in the United States for 40 years. On January 20th, 1995, Secretary of State Warren Christopher delivered a foreign policy speech at Harvard University. After the speech, Christopher, who went from vice chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations into the Clinton cabinet, was asked by a television reporter for his assessment of Newt Gingrich. His one-word answer, given with a wry smile, was internationalist. There are few who would know better than Warren Christopher the full meaning of that one-word description. But haven't traditional-minded Americans been told repeatedly that Gingrich is their champion? That he will always put America first? That he is a tough, no-nonsense American? That he will lead the revolution against big government? Sad to say, the facts speak otherwise again and again. The CFR membership of Speaker Gingrich places him alongside President Clinton, Secretary of State Christopher, and over 500 other U.S. government officials who share membership in this seat of internationalist establishment power. In July 1995, the New York Times featured Gingrich in a front-page article whose headline labeled him a foreign policy novice. But the Times delighted in pointing out that Gingrich's favorite foreign policy mentor is Henry Kissinger. It claimed that Kissinger is doing a good job schooling the speaker. Kissinger, the architect of much of America's disastrous foreign policy over recent years, is another member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It certainly follows that he is a huge promoter of international trade entanglements, excuse me, such as NAFTA and GATT, both backed by Newt Gingrich. Also in July 1995, Gingrich gave a speech at the Center for Strategic and International Affairs. In it, he said, quote, "The American challenge in leading the world is compounded by our Constitution," end quote. He suggested that we would have to rethink our Constitution. Again, we see that the oath he swore means little to him. He also told his audience, "I believe in a very strong central government. You can have a very strong but limited federal government." No, you can't. Certainly not under the Constitution. The founders wanted the central government weak, not strong. It was to be tied down to merely protecting rights. In April 1996, President Clinton signed the new federal budget. While doing so, he repeatedly thanked congressional leaders, Speaker Gingrich and Senate Majority Leader Dole, for backing down and not scrapping an array of government programs that should be scrapped. He went out of his way to heap praise on these Republicans. He said he was pleased that Congress restored the programs, followed his urging regarding others, and adopted recommendations for some more. These programs, all of which were supposed to be terminated according to Gingrich, include oppressive environmental laws, the National Service Program, the United Nations-inspired Goals 2000 program for America's schools, federal financing of local police, and UN peacekeeping missions for our nation's military. All of this will continue, and none of it should. President Clinton thanked Gingrich and Dole for their cooperation. It's obvious the American people need better leadership. In May 1996, Gingrich angered pro-family groups by endorsing a homosexual program led by an admitted homosexual congressman from Wisconsin. For his endorsement of that program, Gingrich received praise from a Washington, D.C. newspaper published for homosexuals. In addition to Gingrich's disdain for the Constitution, he has managed to acquire a reputation as a brash, unfeeling, and arrogant know-it-all. His negative rating amongst the American people is higher than Bill Clinton's. Democratic candidates from coast to coast are looking forward to tying their Republican opponent to the controversy surrounding the Speaker, controversy that has been created largely by the Speaker himself. A very astute observer of American politics recently summarized the difficult situation facing good congressmen who seek re-election in 1996. He said this: Gingrich has achieved something almost unthinkable. He has kept Republican freshmen from being conservative and yet set them up for possible defeat in November for being too conservative. That takes brilliance. In recent months, a handful of sitting Democratic congressmen have switched party allegiance and are now listed as Republicans. One man the Republican leaders have tried to lure into their party is Democratic Congressman Gene Taylor of Mississippi. His conservative ratings are higher than almost all Republicans, including GOP leaders Army, DeLay, and Archer. But Congressman Taylor has resisted any suggestion that he become a Republican. He recently told his constituents that he has never been a follower of the National Democrats and does not want to be classified with them. He expects to be questioned by the voters of his very conservative district because he retains membership in the political party that includes Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Richard Gephardt, and other leftist Democrats. But he told the New York Times in January 1996, "I can clearly point out that Newt Gingrich was a draft dodger and that Newt Gingrich deserted his wife and family as soon as he got elected, so they're going to have a much harder time painting the Republicans as holy." Sad to say, Congressman Taylor is correct about Gingrich. The renowned Gingrich abrasiveness has become such a problem for fellow Republicans that his friend and ally in Republican circles, Paul Weyrich, took him to task in a Washington Times column in November of 1995. Weyrich told the speaker to tone down his rhetoric and cease making combative statements before every available television camera. Early in 1996, freshman Republican Congressman John Hostetler of Indiana wrote a letter to Gingrich and released it to the press. It said, "I am today declining your unsolicited offer to attend a fundraiser in southwestern Indiana to benefit my reelection." Hostetler felt he was better off getting ready for reelection on his own than having Gingrich by his side. And that attitude has spread amongst the very best of the Republicans in the House. Congressmen who do care about the Constitution have been complaining about being called on the carpet by Gingrich for disloyalty. Disloyalty to what? Not to the Constitution, but to the party and to the leadership of the party. Was the Constitution ever mentioned? Not on your life. 3 times each year, the John Birch Society publishes a report card for each of the 435 members of the House of Representatives. Each of these report cards shows an X for a vote for higher taxes and more government, or it shows a star for a vote for lower taxes and less government. The standard is the U.S. Constitution. In other words, if a House member votes for something that is not authorized by the Constitution, foreign aid or education, housing, agriculture subsidies, etc., he'll be awarded an X. Votes against such measures earn stars. And now you can see here we have a chart. Here are some examples of the trim bulletins for the big spenders. You see solid rows of X's. Sad to say there are plenty of these. The congressmen that are pictured here, this one is from Connecticut, and then this one is from Massachusetts. This one is from Missouri. Down here we've got one from Vermont, and another one from Massachusetts. That's no surprise, I guess, is it? Right. Well, let's show another chart, and here are some examples of the trim bulletins for the guardians of the Constitution and the people's purse. Solid rows of stars. All right, now who are these people? Well, we've got one for the first one from Illinois, and then we've got one from New York and Missouri. This one is from Arizona, and here's one from Florida. You see all the stars. There are no X's for these men on this particular rating period for each of them. Trim bulletins are distributed by John Birch Society members all across the nation. Tens of thousands, even scores of thousands of these bulletins help voters in their particular district to know what their representative in Washington is doing, not just what he's saying. So let's look now at a trim bulletin for Gingrich. As you know, once a man becomes Speaker, he rarely votes. He's certainly allowed to vote, but a tradition says he does not. And the Speaker generally doesn't vote unless his vote is needed to break a tie. So a current trim bulletin for Newt Gingrich would not be very instructive. But here's a trim bulletin depicting his record in 1994, the year before he was given the Speaker's gavel. As you can see, he got 6 X's out of 8 votes. Now, what are those X's for? This one is for voting for the National Endowment for the Arts. This one is voting for an extra $1.2 billion for UN peacekeeping. Here we've got Department of Education funding. Here we've got funds for the Housing Department. Here we've got more funds for the Housing Department. And here we've got $13 billion for foreign aid. This is in 1994. None of this is authorized by the Constitution. Yet the media tells us that Newt Gingrich is the leader of the conservative opposition to Bill Clinton. But Bill Clinton was in favor of all of these expenditures of taxpayers' money. Now here's another trim bulletin for Gingrich in 1994. And as you can see, we got 4 X's this time out of a possible 8 votes. He voted for financing private businesses with government loans. He voted for more funds for the Department of Education. Down here, he voted for $166 million more for the IRS. And down here, this is the vote for the passage of the GATT measure, which compromises U.S. sovereignty in favor of the World Trade Organization. Now, the votes that we are describing here are quite sinister, and the whole business that we're describing is quite sinister. Americans have been talked out of the Constitution and its limitations on government power. Repeatedly, we are expected to make judgments based on someone being labeled either conservative or liberal, terms that are not defined. Today, a man with a record like Gingrich's can be described as a conservative. Henry Kissinger has announced that he's a conservative. You get an idea of how much substance this term conveys after examining the records of those whom the media brands conservative and keeps telling us that they are conservatives. In truth, the term conservative has been co-opted by big government, by New World Order advocates, and by closet socialists. Reduced to its bare essentials, the New World Order means world government and economic control through socialism. Steps toward it include delivering our nation's military to the United Nations and to its subsidiary known as NATO. On the domestic front, building the New World Order calls for increased taxation, regulations, controls, bureaucracy, and big brother government. None of this is allowed by the Constitution, but it is all happening, isn't it? The test for Americans should never be whether someone is conservative or liberal. These undefined terms float all over the political landscape. The test should be adherence to the Constitution, which is defined. If it were truly and honestly enforced, the federal government would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. The Constitution does not allow the federal government to give away foreign aid, to send U.S. military personnel all over the globe and even place them under foreign commanders. The Constitution does not authorize federal involvement in education, agriculture, housing, welfare, energy, transportation, medicine, citizen ownership of firearms, and a great deal more. Some persons would be shocked to hear what I've just stated. They think that the federal government has to be involved in education and housing, almost to the point of holding that if the federal government were not involved, there wouldn't be any education or agriculture or medical care and so forth. But there certainly would be. And if the federal government were removed from these fields, there would be better education, more and better housing, less costly medical care, and so forth. From his own statements and from his performance as a congressman, it's obvious that Gingrich has no use for the Constitution. He would have concerned Americans simply follow his lead while the steady drive to subject them to the Constitution to a constitutional convention or a conference of the states proceeds. You see, the people who don't like the Constitution want to get their hands on it for a rewrite, which is precisely what would happen if a constitutional convention were ever assembled. As long as Gingrich remains unexposed, we are forced to conclude that the federal juggernaut will not be stopped and our nation will continue moving into all phases of the New World Order. This will mean the end of independence for our nation and freedom for the American people. We must not only preserve the Constitution, we must increasingly demand adherence to it by those who swear an oath to it. This is the way to renew America, not the route offered by Newt Gingrich, Bill Clinton, and others. Clinton and Gingrich, of course, both of whom members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the ever-present internationalist group that has such a grip on our government. And this is a very large and, we must realize that the departure from sound government I have been describing did not happen by chance and is not the result of a run of poor luck. Americans are up against a conspiracy of monstrous evil. Whether Gingrich is a member of its inner core or just a self-promoting collaborator is not for us to dwell on this evening. What we must always keep in mind is that evil seeks out ambitious and unprincipled individuals whom it can get to do its work. For many years, the conspiratorial drive to create a new world order has been scoring huge successes. So we have to get back to the document all national leaders have sworn an oath to uphold. Look at the very first sentence in the Constitution. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. That's pretty clear. All lawmaking power is in Congress, and Congress has no authority to delegate its powers. This means that the Supreme Court has no lawmaking power. Yet we hear all the time that a Supreme Court decision is the law of the land. It isn't, and it can't be. It's merely the law of the case. The first sentence in the Constitution also tells us that the process by which all of the gigantic bureaucratic agencies create their own laws by simply publishing them in the Federal Register and taking on the force of law, that's completely wrong too. Bureaucracies can't create law. Only Congress can, according to the first sentence in this Constitution of the United States. But what about herein granted? Those two words in that first sentence. They mean that the only lawmaking powers possessed by Congress must be specifically stated within the body of the Constitution. If power is not herein granted, it's illegitimate. I challenge anyone to find power to dispense foreign aid herein granted, or to find authorization herein granted for the federal government to have anything to say about education, housing, the right to own a handgun, and so much more. The Constitution must be restored to full force and effect. But the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the man Americans are told is the great conservative leader, doesn't want to restore it. He wants it to die and be replaced. So how do Americans restore the Constitution and take their country back? Let's turn to the first sentence of Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution, where we read, all bills for raising revenues shall originate in the House of Representatives. That, too, is very easy to understand. If the House refuses to originate a bill for foreign aid, education, housing, the United Nations, there's nothing the Senate, the President, the Supreme Court, or anyone else can do about it. The power of the purse is in the House, deliberately placed there by the Founding Fathers. What's needed, therefore, is a majority of House members who will refuse to originate such bills. And this is where trim bulletins can be so very helpful. Trim never tells anyone to vote for or against a congressman. It simply publishes the record regarding spending measures. And Trim activists throughout the nation distribute these report cards depicting the record of their own congressman 3 times each year by the tens of thousands. As a result, voters finally discover what their congressman is doing. If they like what they see on the Trim bulletin, they re-elect him or her, I guess. If they don't like what they see, they might elect someone else. It's up to them. Trim educates the voting public, and an educated voting public is precisely what this nation needs. If more than half of the House of Representatives members stand firmly with the Constitution, they can unravel the whole New World Order apparatus. They can stop foreign aid, cease funding the United Nations, put an end to the gigantic bureaucratic agencies that are choking America, remove government from education, from housing, from agriculture, from energy, and from so much more. Refusal to originate any bill to fund the unconstitutional programs wouldn't even face a veto by the President. He can't veto what isn't proposed. A majority of Constitution-minded representatives can even choose a new Speaker. All the power needed to get America back on track resides in the House of Representatives. We hear a great deal of talk in our country today about the need to balance the federal budget. Right now, the accumulated national debt exceeds $5 trillion. It costs $300 billion per year for interest. So what do our leaders propose? Democrat and Republican leaders tell us they plan to balance the budget in 7 years. This means that for at least 6 more years, They plan to add to the national debt and to the interest bill borne by the taxpayers. The John Birch Society believes that the budget can be balanced in a matter of months. 2 very easily understood steps would get the job done. First step, terminate all foreign aid, including Mexican-style bailouts. All of it is completely unconstitutional to begin with, and it hardly makes sense for a nation so heavily indebted as ours to be giving away money. And the second step would be to bring the troops home. Why should we be absorbing the defense budget for Japan and South Korea and Germany and Italy and so many other countries? Bring the troops home and restate that their sole mission is the protection of the life, liberty, and property of the American people. Some will call that isolationism, but I'm not an isolationist, and I don't think you are either. What are we? We're non-interventionists with the sons and the daughters and the wallets of the American people. The John Birch Society wants the people of this nation to be free to deal with the people of other nations, with little or no government involvement. We are prone to quote the great English leader Richard Cobden, who stated a century and a half ago, "Peace will come to this earth when her peoples have as much as possible to do with each other, their governments the least possible." We've talked about a conspiracy, and we've talked about the establishment. The 2 terms are virtually synonymous. Many Americans have been persuaded to roll their eyes and scoff at the notion that powerfully placed individuals would secretly plot to sell out this nation. But if they had the evidence that we'd be delighted to share with them, they might very well find themselves persuaded that the matter of conspiracy isn't a theory, it's a fact. This conspiracy must be fought, not with debate and mere logic, but with exposure, solid principles, courage, and determination. And as many more Americans are finding out, that is exactly what the John Birch Society is all about. There had to be some good citizens in Germany who early on tried to warn their friends and neighbors about a man named Hitler. But most of those they approached reacted negatively and said they were crazy, or they called them paranoid. Others rolled their eyes and said it couldn't possibly happen in their country. But it did. There were people in Russia who knew what the Bolsheviks wanted and tried to warn others. They met with similar resistance. There were people in China, in Cuba, and so many other places throughout history who tried to sound an alarm before it was too late, and they failed too. Here in America, virtually everyone knows that government is too powerful and grows more powerful. We know that American industry is being pushed overseas by government taxes, regulations, controls, subsidies for foreign governments, etc. We know that our leaders continue to deepen our entanglements in international organizations like the United Nations and NATO and NAFTA and GATT and the World Trade Organization. We know that our military is being converted into the UN's global cop for the entire world. If the Constitution were adhered to, there would be none of this. And so we send a warning to fellow Americans. We ask you to take a hard look at the evidence we can supply about what is wrong in America and how it can be made right. You owe it to yourselves to examine our program. So many who have done so have found to their great surprise and utter delight that there is an organization such as ours, standing for principle and working for less government, defending sovereignty and encouraging across-the-board responsibility. Americans all across this land must realize that they are being persuaded to follow false leaders, to put confidence in men who don't deserve your confidence, and to adopt as a standard virtually meaningless media characterizations, conservative and liberal, instead of the Constitution. Understanding the real Newt Gingrich and others like him is essential. The choice before all of us is to continue to be misled by media-created leaders like Gingrich, or to demand that leaders of both major political parties, or any political party, adhere strictly to the U.S. Constitution. It's time for a change. a real change. Back to the basics that made this country the greatest in all history. Back to voters, choosing as their elected officials men and women who want less government and not more, who foster more responsibility and not less, and who know that God should not be excluded from America's affairs. The job that lies before our nation can be accomplished, but it will take men and women of character who are determined to leave for our children and their children the wonderful country that we were born into or had the good sense to come into. And to all who fit that description, we say, come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking. Contact the John Birch Society for information, and then join our unique organization. Also, if you're in the habit of praying, and I hope you are, pray hard, but at the same time, work hard to create awareness about what is happening to this nation. Thank you all for listening. May God bless you all, and may God bless America. Thank you very much.